Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last seminar for the year. We are absolutely delighted today to be welcoming Dr. Clara Fontdevila to our seminar series. Clara is currently a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of Glasgow. And today she's going to be talking to us about unpacking faith-based provision, implications for the pluralist case on publicly funded religious schools. So I will not labor the point. I will pass over to you, Clara. Take it away, please.
Well, thanks very much, Sonia and Mubarak, for the invite, first of all, and yeah, very happy to be here. So let me quickly share my slides. Hope that everyone can see that. So as Sonia was commenting, the object of research I'm bringing here today are faith-based schools, sometimes called religious schools, different terminologies. But I'm focusing especially on the private ones that benefit from some form of government subsidy. Essentially because I felt that this has been a bit of a neglected object within studies of education policy and so on. So very quickly, and this kind of captures the argument in a nutshell, I will try to make the case for studying publicly funded religious schools and then trying to understand the normative arguments that have been made around them and the need for a more situated understanding informed by empirical research, essentially overcoming or going beyond the more philosophical and theoretical literature around them. Then simply to illustrate the potential and interest of a more empirical approach, I will try to focus on one of the variables that, as I have found, have been less well understood, yet it deserves further attention, which is school level variables or the diversity of publicly funded religious schools. The fact that there is a bit at this point an unproductive category, and I will illustrate this with a couple of case studies I have been conducting later on along with various colleagues. Now we'll try to end up with some policy-related remarks. So essentially, because this is a question that I am posed sometimes, why focus on publicly funded religious schools? Essentially, as the saying goes, we live in some people claim increasingly secular world, which is not exactly the case, but there is a bit this idea that religious schools are a thing of the past or a thing that we have all made our minds around them and so on. My perception is that there are at least empirical reasons to focus on them, but also the fact that there are the object of unresolved or unaddressed normative tensions, and both of them merit some attention. First of all, and simply to provide some figures or set the thing, the thing is that particularly in Europe, faith-based providers enroll a very significant number of students. It varies across countries, but especially in what is sometimes called old quasi-markets or historical public-private partnerships. They are significant. They are, in fact, the main modality of private provision. And they are important because their establishment as publicly funded providers generally predates the advent of neoliberalism. They have been there for a while. And I think that because of that, there are good reasons to think that both structurally and functionally, the kind of quasi-markets that this kind of provision generates are different from all the other markets that we understand better at this point, the more classical markets motivated by some sort of neoliberal agenda and explicitly aimed at generating competition. This is not the case of this kind of markets. They were not created with this explicit competitive goal and so on. And yet, research exists, but it's a bit fragmentary. We have a lot of research on education markets, but the category of religious school is sometimes addressed as a bit of a unitary thing. It has received limited attention or limited attempts at unpacking it. Secondly, there is a good deal of sociology of education research that focus on minority schools, the kind of schools created by minority faiths in many OECD countries, Muslim schools and so on, Jewish schools, because they are particular and they have faced their own challenges. This has attracted some attention. And then we have a very US-centric literature on Catholic schools. Sometimes there is discussion on the Catholic school effect and so on. Here, my contention is that this literature has limited informative potential for the European context. The role occupied by Catholic schools and religious schools in the States is very particular and cannot be compared with the structural role that these kind of schools occupy in different countries in Europe. Just to give you, again, some figures, but in countries like France, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, they are a significant share. Of course, this is not the case in other countries, where some of which have a relatively significant subsidized sector, but it's not dominated at all by religious providers. So we have a bit of a mixed picture, but my point is we really need to try to understand the particularities of these religiously dominated education quasi-markets. And then there is the question of the normative debate around them. In fact, this kind of provision has been the object of some polarizing debates and some long-standing debates. Their very presence is routinely contested. There is permanent discussion and political discussion. Should we really be funding this kind of schools? With different actors claiming that a better separation or a stronger separation between state and church is necessary, and so on. And it's a kind of normative debate that it is connected, but is not exactly the same that the school choice debate. Essentially, here, what are sometimes called non-consequentialist considerations, more related to rights, the intrinsic value of freedom, the right to choose, the intrinsic value of choice, again, parental rights play a bigger role in this kind of debates than in the school choice debates, in which these considerations play a role, but more consequential considerations related to the production and redistribution of the education good are the main thing under discussion. So essentially what we are finding, and I will cover this in greater depth later on, is that religious schools, publicly funded religious schools, in many ways bring to the fore tensions between different social justice principles or different understandings of social justice principles. They are simultaneously seen as a way of ensuring some sort of cultural recognition, representation, but of course this sometimes clashes with other desirable goals like the redistribution, equality of opportunity, social cohesion, and so on. So in this sense, they have been attracted attention, but this kind of a scholarly attention has mainly occurred in philosophical quarters, so they are a recurrent object of debate in the philosophy of education and even political philosophy realm, which means that the kind of scholarship this has generated retains a very abstract category. Essentially, it is concerned with the ideal dimensions of the debate. It relies on a kind of deductive style of reasoning, which and is largely divorced from what empirical evidence say. Not that it is deliberately ignoring it, it's just not part of the way of working of this kind of scholars. And in my view, this was a bit of a missed opportunity, especially if we want to pursue some kind of policy action in relation to that, if we want to make decisions on how to better regulate them to affect these kind of tensions, we need to understand exactly where the problem lies, when these kind of problems or tensions between social justice principles emerge, what can be done about them. This requires paying attention to the more empirical literature. So, before entering into that, I think that it's important, as I was commenting, to understand the kind of normative defense and criticisms of publicly funded religious schools. And here, essentially, what is probably most distinctive of this kind of debate is that it rests on the pluralist argument that if we, essentially, as the argument goes, is if we really care about diversity as an intrinsic value, one of the best ways of accommodating and honoring such diversity is allowing for some degree of institutional differentiation on religious lines. So essentially allowing for and supporting financially religious schools. This is a bit the origin of the argument. This comes in different flavors. Sometimes there is a more community and recognition focused argument that essentially emphasizes cultural continuity, the fact that it is in the right of parents and in the interest of children to ensure this sense of cultural compactness. Sometimes the argument focuses more on the distinctive educational ethos of religious schools, the fact that they bring something to the table that the state schools or other kind of schools could never provide. And sometimes the focus is very much on the right to rear, the parental rights, and the intrinsic value of choice. So we have these different flavors, but decided that the best way of honoring pluralism is to allowing for this diversity is there. Interestingly enough, the same pluralistic argument has sometimes been articulated precisely as a defense of the common school ideal, saying essentially that precisely in a context of increasing diversity and so on, a way of safeguarding against fragmentation, a way of ensuring that the democratic ideals are transmitted, that we all have the necessary civic skills to deal in these increasingly diverse societies, is the common school. So the pluralist argument, in a way, has been deployed for both sides of the camp, but it's much more central in the normative defense. It is essentially the meaty part of the argument. So what are the criticisms or the kind of social just intentions that have routinely been brought by the literature? First of all, a concern with the civic and democratic transmission. Here, the focus is on the substance of a school and what these schools are teaching, and there is essentially concern that either because certain curricular or pedagogic choices, but also limited integration with the broader community, there is a risk that these schools are not in a position to transmit the necessary democratic dispositions. A second line of reasoning, connected but separate, is that these schools, because they rely in some sort of homogeneity in the kind of student intake they take, they limit the opportunities for social mixing, essentially, and this has at least two very negative impacts. One is that it, let's say, reduces the redistributive potential of a school as a result of peer effects and composition effects, well studied by the literature. And secondly, in a, again, more non-consequentialist view, there is a preoccupation with the fact that this limits our opportunities for cross-cultural recognition, that we are essentially less able to exist along each other, that this is a risk for social cohesion, tolerance, and so on. And finally, a third argument, maybe less well known, is a preoccupation with children autonomy, essentially the fact that because these schools put children in the kind of schools that their parents desire, to put it very simply, this kind of reduces again the opportunity for children agency, self-determination, well-being, that we are forcing a transmission that in fact we don't have the right to ensure. So these are in the philosophical work, these are the most recurrent sources of concern and criticism and the kind of tension that has been routinely raised. So against this scenario, my question was a little bit, okay, we know that there is a bit of a fragmentary literature, which again is limited and fragmentary, but is there. So what can this literature tells us and why it is important? Essentially, I think that it is important because if we know that these kind of tensions emerge, it is relevant to understand when they are more likely to emerge, what are the mediators, and how can we affect this state of things. There is a let's say, well-thread argument in education policy circles and public policy circles in general that there is some value in the cross-fertilization between the philosophical and empirical scholarship. There is a range of authors with different orientation that have been making this point, from Henry Brickhouse, but also Clayton, Wilson, and so on. The main contention here is that we need to understand what are the mechanisms at work at the root of the phenomena we seek to affect through education policy, and that we need to understand how these mechanisms operate in a specific context rather than in the vacuum. So in relation specifically to the publicly funded religious school debate, my argument is that it is important, first of all, as I was saying, to understand under which circumstances tensions emerge, and to inform policy action, understanding what can be done and also what we cannot affect in some way. Also, there are limits with public action, and I think it's important to understand what are the sources that can be affected, which are not. And finally, facilitate a little bit knowledge consolidation or cross-learning opportunities among contexts when these schools enjoy very different statuses, and that sometimes there is limited dialogue, which again, I think that it kind of hinders scholarly progress. So if we look a little bit on what the literature say, and this is work that we have been conducted with my colleague Ellen van der Hoven here at the University of Glasgow, on the basis of a literature review of different papers with some form of empirical basis, that was the criteria. What does the literature say? Interestingly enough, for all the three tensions, the findings are very mixed, which was probably to be expected. So a first point is that the empirical status of the different tensions is different. In relation to civic and democratic transmission, there is quite an established body of work which is relatively cohesive on this, but the findings are inconclusive anyway. So we find that for certain denomination and in certain contexts, yes, civic and democratic transmission is not affected. In others, yes. Again, difficult to tell what is going on. In the case of the social cohesion and the segregation versus integration argument, here there is an extensive body of research, but there is a bit of a causal attribution problem because, in fact, when you read this text, it's difficult to isolate what comes from the fact that these schools operate in a market environment and what is specific to the fact that they have a religious ethos and that some parents attending them, but not all of them, have religiosity rational in their school choice decisions. So essentially, there is a clear association between the presence of these schools and segregation patterns, essentially because they are in this market environment, which has a well-proven relationship with segregation and other and the social stratification of schools. The research is a bit more inconclusive on how this affects attitudes towards diversity. Here, there is a lot of literature more from the social psychology realm about the contact hypothesis, under which conditions mere contact translates into some change of attitudes and so on. Again, kind of uncertain. When it comes to children autonomy, this is a very limited area with empirical scholarship, and the findings are contradictory. In some cases, there is evidence that this has an effect on children's well-being, especially when it comes to the school's approach to perceived deviant behaviors, LGBTI students, and so on. But there is not much around that with an empirical basis. So most of these papers advance some sort of causal intuitions, as we call it. So they kind of present some sort of a story of what might be going on, which is diverse. And we don't have, I think, time to go in depth with all of them. But what was important for us in reading these papers is that essentially the main finding is this is varied or this is mixed. So the next question was that, okay, according to what? What are the factors that foster publicly funded religious schools in some context to be in tension with, for instance, the transmission of democratic values? Why is that in other contexts this doesn't happen? What are the main mediators of these diverging outcomes? And again, on the basis of a bit of the literature, it is possible to identify three main groups of factors. Ones are the more macro level factors, informed more from sociology of religion perspectives. And essentially, what we find is that across different countries, obviously, different religious groups differ very much in their de jure, but also their de facto status. So in some countries, they are given lots of facilities for the establishment of the schools. There is a bit of a privileged relationship with the state for certain faiths, but not for others. Religious minorities are accommodated to different degrees. And in a more de facto level, what we are seeing is that religious groups occupy different positions in the social hierarchies, social prejudice dynamics in different societies. And this affects the kind of outcomes of these schools because, to put it very bluntly, we are mixing contexts in which the main kind of publicly funded religious schools are minority schools in a context where there is a kind of privileged majoritarian faith, with other cases where publicly funded religious schools are aligned with a majority faith whose main competition is the people not adhering to any kind of faith. So it's a bit complex and it creates different school choice patterns, different behaviors on the part of schools and so on. More on the meso level, this also has a determining effect on the segregation, the democratic transmission, the children autonomy concept, because essentially these schools operate in very different regulatory environments. But what is more critical and perhaps less obvious is that the outcomes of these schools are very much directly affected by how religion is governed in non-religious schools. Because this affects the expectation and the demands of parents opting for this kind of schools. So again, this might not be obvious, but is a bit at the root of this diversity of findings. And finally, and my argument is that this is one of the areas that is more critical and less well understood. We know, and all the literature reports that implicitly or explicitly, that religious schools differ very much. This is a bit of an empty category, and they differ in two main aspects. First of all, what does it mean that they are religious? Their religiosity. It manifests to different degrees and very different ways. And secondly, to what extent they perceive themselves as being part of the public education system, simply being a kind of private provider of a public service. And in some cases, they perceive themselves as private actors mostly concerned with a private agenda. This again presents some diversity. And essentially, because of the combination of that, we are seeing different parental perceptions and expectations around these schools, but also different opportunities and incentives for these schools to reinforce some of these outcomes or not. So, focusing on these school level variables and what does it mean to be a publicly funded religious schools, I think it's worth trying to unpacking this in relation to these two elements, religiosity and publicness, essentially because this gives important policy pointers. If we know that not all religious schools are equally equipped or willing to be contributing to this social justice principles or dimensions, democracy, social mixing, social cohesion, children's autonomy, if we know that not all of them are equally ready to do so, this provides us with some guidance on who should we be funding, under which conditions, and so on. So I think that it helps because it moves the debate from should we be funding publicly religious schools at all, which is complex and we are already funding them in many countries. It shifts the arguments towards, okay, which publicly religious schools, under which conditions, how can we make sure that they collaborate towards rather than against some system level goals. So I will try to illustrate this with two case studies. Simply to provide some context, I will be focusing on Spain and France, which share some similarities but also some differences. In both cases, we are funding that these are countries where religious provision has a long story. This is a bit of a surprise for France because of all the emphasis on the laicity principle. Sometimes it is understood that there is no place for religion in public life, and this is partially true, but specifically when it comes to religious schools, they represent an important share of the market, and they have been doing so for many years. This predates clearly the advent of neoliberalism. In fact, the law that establishes that is from the 50s. In the case of Spain, similarly, this is a central part of the education market, religious schools, that was institutionalized with the advent of democracy and the creation of the modern education system. So these are countries where religious provision is very much a fixture of the education system, even if rationales at the origin are a bit different. And in both cases, this is a sector in which the subsidized education sector is dominated by religious providers, specifically by Catholic providers. They have the lion's share of the privately subsidized education market. And the governance models are relatively similar, nonetheless, because the Spanish law that governs these schools was copied from the French law. So essentially, this is a particular model in which the schools benefit from generous, I would say, public funding in exchange of some degree of autonomy. So they have a lot of public funding, not for everything, so they still rely on tuition fees from parents, and they have a lot of autonomy, not for everything, so they have to align to many of the guidelines provided by the state. And especially in the case of France, there is a more pronounced relying, I would say, on tuition fees and on selective practices, because the state has been has come a little later in trying to control these elements. So, analytical consideration, simply to give you a couple of pointers, is that the question of religiosity and the need to unpack this concept has been a bit of a recurrent theme within social policy studies of so-called faith-based providers. And essentially, I think that at this point there are four consensual points. First, that religiosity is a continuous rather than a dichotomic thing, that it changes for the same organization, it has a dynamic nature according to state action and so on, that it is multidimensional, and that it is useful to distinguish between the religiosity of the provider per se and how present is this religiosity in the service they deliver, because there are some cases of clearly compartmentalization attempts. Same goes a bit with publicness. This has been a more prominent theme in education policy studies, with different authors claiming that we really need to gain some conceptual clarity and measurement clarity on the boundaries between public and private, and essentially the idea that publicness is a complex notion. And here I think that there is a literature, again, more focusing on general public policy that provides some interesting pointers or intuitions. First of all, that ownership and the for-profit, non-for-profit status is not a particularly great predictor to understand the different degrees of publicness. Secondly, that the goals, the values, the ethos of these organizations have a lot of explanatory power but defy easy measurement, to put it mildly. And secondly, that just like religiosity, publicness is a multidimensional construct. So you can be very publicly oriented in some of your areas of work and not very publicly oriented in others. So it requires some unpacking. So I will try to study the religiosity element in relation to the Spanish or Catalan context. So this is a case study focusing on the Catalonia region in Spain, which is autonomous in many elements, but shares many similarities with the broader Spanish environment. Two elements that I think that are relevant for this study of religiosity of publicly funded religious schools. First of all, that both in Spain and Catalonia, we are witnessing growing levels of secularization, people who do not adhere to any religion, and also growing levels of religious diversity, which is directly connected to the fact that we have seen a relatively rapid increase of migrant population over the last decades, which has essentially translated in an increase in the diversity of the student population, not only of the general population. So in this context, I was wondering, this work done with my colleagues Antoni Vergé and Adriana Zancajo from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. My question was a bit what happens with these Catholic providers in such a changing context? How do they respond or adapt, especially in a context where they are experimenting potentially shrinking demand because of the process of demographic decline? What do they do? The empirical strategy was interviews with 11 main networks of Catholic providers operating in Catalonia with different we ensured that it was heterogeneous enough in terms of the size, the kind of funding religious community, and so on. I can provide further details, but essentially on the basis of these 11 networks, what we found is that it is possible to distinguish at least three main approaches to the question of religious identity and expression. First of all, and this is probably the most obvious or the one that most people have in mind, there is the confessional approach in which, let's say that not only religious education, but the daily routines of the school life are really embedded in the Catholic tradition, and there is an attempt towards the transmission of this tradition. So it's closer to the indoctrination pole. Interestingly, here, these are schools that not only have a very secure and strong, let's say, market position, but also schools in which there is very limited institutional distance between the founding religious bodies and the school administrators. They are essentially organically embedded. A second variety is what we term the culture-centric variety, in which religious education is more focused on the cultural dimension of religion, variously defined, and essentially this is an attempt to still the Catholic tradition is very central, but not the focus is not in the doctrine, the faith exactly, but what does it mean from a cultural perspective. In some cases, this is better articulated than in others, depending on the resource of the school, because it's this attempt to go beyond the typical path and do something different. And this, interestingly, is the case of schools with a bit of a complex, sometimes market positions, in which many of these networks include some schools in a very weak position, essentially in this changing market. So I think that there is a certain attempt to adapting to a changing student intake and making sure that they are not alienating any group in a context in which they see their own demand shrinking. And finally, there is a third variety that essentially focus more on the values or the axiomatic dimensions of religion's tradition, the spirituality ingrained in it, what does it mean for our own reflection, how to behave, and so on. So it kind of keeps religion out from the spirituality in a strange move. And these are schools that have a relatively secure market position, so they are not so clearly fighting a potential decrease in demand and so on, but that have a much more diverse, for different reasons, school intake, student intake. So again, they find themselves in the position to catering to different needs and expectations of a very diverse, relatively diverse group of families attending these schools. So, and moving now to the French context and what does it potentially tells us about what is publicness and how these schools experiment publicness. France, in this regard, is an interesting case study because, as I was saying, historically, there has been little clarity on whether these were schools with a clear public role or a private one. In fact, according to the law, it's quite an hybrid role because they are defined as private providers of a public service. And this has been interpreted differently, but increasingly the pressure has been towards reinforcing the public service component. And they have been under the spotlight for a while right now, precisely given increasingly or growing evidence of their impact on segregation dynamics, but also as a result of different scandals of different types that again has put these institutions under the spotlight, and the fact or has led different actors to wonder to what extent these schools are providing a public service, and if not, why should we be funding them. But at the same time, especially certain parts of the Catholic hierarchy in France have been demanding and institutionalizing, in fact, through the statuses of the Enseignement Catholique. They have been fighting for further visibility and centrality of the Catholic component in this publicly funded religious school sector, essentially saying we do not need to hide it. This has not been equally well received by all Catholic providers, but is part of this, let's say, debate on to what extent Catholic schools in France are providing and should be providing a public service, to what extent this is a self-serving role they are playing, and so on. So essentially, we are in this changing situation in which much is at stake because different actors fear that there might be some sort of legislative regulatory change incoming. So the empirical strategy here is a bit more ample. Essentially, we have been interviewing some, of course, representative from the organizations, umbrella organization representing the sector, but then interviewing essentially managers and senior officials from a selection of Catholic school networks in 3 regions, and some of the religious representatives of the religious communities who held the guardianship of these school networks. We have sampled 3 different regions, Ile-de-France, PACA, and Bretagne, which have present some differences in terms of the segregation dynamics, the public associated with the presence of the private sector, the relative importance of the Catholic sector therein, the evolution of these dynamics, the localization within the territory, and so on. Again, I can provide further details, but yeah, it mostly relies on interviews from these 3 different areas. And essentially, and I'm finishing here, I know I'm running out of time, but what we found is that at least 3 or 4 understandings of their role as providers of a public service coexist and are in dispute. Essentially, so we identified 2 main axes, or we think it's useful to think of it in 2 different axes. First of all, to what extent do different providers think that their role is to produce public good, to work towards these state mandated goals of equity, social cohesion, economic progress, and so on? And to what extent, and this is a bit more tricky, they think that them themselves should be a public good in the sense of not being exclusable, being mostly governed through a public deliberative methods, bringing different stakeholders in, or whether they should be governed as a private organization. And on the basis of this, it is interesting to see that there is a small group, I would say, of policy entrepreneurs operating in some of these umbrella organizations that, let's say, score high in the we should be producing public goods and we should be a public good themselves. And there is this expressive alignment saying, look, providing this sort of public service is simply an expression of what is sometimes called of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. This is relatively rare, to be clear. What we are seeing most commonly is, first of all, a kind of selecting alignment saying, yes, we should be providing public goods, but in our own terms. So we should be able to regulate them ourselves, deciding how are we going to do this. Case in point, in a context in which their contribution to segregation is increasingly attracting attention, there has been attempts to say you need to find ways of making your schools economically more accessible to different social strata. And these schools have said essentially, fine, but we want to have our own way of dealing with that. So rather than relying on public scholarship, extra public funding, we will create an internal system of bursaries in which the, let's say, better off students are de facto subsidizing less better off students, which has created some tensions within the schools for obvious reasons. But this is this kind of self-regulation approach, or yes, public goods according to our own definition of what it means. And then there is an instrumental alignment in which we are finding providers that kind of cope with this and saying, yeah, we can try to behave more as public goods and we should probably contributing to public goods, but you sense less of an expressive alignment. And this is very much driven by the fear that the context is not favorable to this kind of schools and that this is a way of ensuring survival. Of course, at the other end of a spectrum, and this is not marginal, there are some providers or guardianships, especially certain interviewees closer to the religious pole rather than the educational one, that are in favor of a non-alignment strategy, essentially saying, no, yes, we benefit from some form of public funding, but this obeys historical rationals and essentially emphasize the pluralistic case for this kind of funding, but do not try to align, do not think it is their job to align with this public goods rationale. So essentially, and I cannot provide much more detail because this is work in progress, so we have not quite identified the main covariates of these different positions, and of course we are not allowed yet to share any kind of quotations for that, but essentially, I think that what it emerges from this is that the whole idea of publicness and how people understand publicness, to what extent they think these providers that it is their obligation, it's mixed, and this offers sometimes opportunities for policy action, but also identify certain courses of action as probably potentially ineffective, I would say. So just to conclude, in terms of remarks, I think that first of all, as I was saying, this is a bit like one step in a broader debate. So I think that it is important to identify or to try to inform all these normative debates with empirical work, but this is not the entirety of the story. So if we want to identify appropriate courses of action, understand what is possible, what is not possible, it would be important to start understanding what are the policy instruments in our hands. And here again, I think that there is a bit of an opportunity to try to learn of what different countries have been using, but to this end, we need also some sort of greater conceptual clarity or a bit of a framework to understand these different policies, which, as far as I can tell, does not exist at the moment. So understanding how this is being addressed with tools, policy tools, would be interesting. And secondly, I would argue that these debates are maybe informative, not only in the education realm, but in the broader welfare debate on the welfare state in Europe. Essentially, the reliance on mixed provision is more the norm than the exception at this point, and it happens in a variety of areas of social policy. So, but this also means that the landscape of private providers is increasingly diverse, or has always been diverse, but we are increasingly aware of it. We need to understand how do these providers differ? And I think that here again there is clarity that ownership will not suffice. It's important to be able to measure public service motivation, but again, literature it's there but emerging. And here I would say that the question of value or ideational congruence is important. I think that the French case is a very good example of the fact that this varies hugely, even within a supposedly unitary sector that is governed by the same umbrella organization. There are different understandings or different degrees of ideation congruence between what the state wants and what these providers think is their role. So I think that there is something to be gained from better understanding these dynamics. And with this, I will end. Well, thank you very much.